Hey everyone, welcome back. So recently we got to take an early look at Dune Awakening, the upcoming survival sandbox MMO from Conan Exile and Secret World developer Funcom. This was a hands-off event, meaning we didn't get to actually play the game, unfortunately, but we did see a 30-minute presentation and gameplay walkthrough, during which we not only saw the game running in action, but also got a bunch of new information and details. Let's take a look. So they open things up by showcasing the early portions of the game, beginning with character creation. Dune Awakening looks to offer the expected suite of customization options with sliders for your height, body parts, face, hair, eyes, and other features. The general look of characters appeared and was also said to be directly inspired by the recent Dune films, and you can kind of see that in how the characters are designed and their presentation and all of that. So after deciding how you look, you then get to choose your backstory and the starting class. Now the backstory includes where you were born as well as your caste, which determines things like your dialogue traits and unique emotes. The dialogue traits are said to provide additional options when you're speaking with NPCs, so think like Bethesda style here, where you'll be granted different responses to questions NPCs ask you, depending on your backstory, your history, your caste, your birth location, all of that. And then there are the classes. Now there were 4 options to choose from what we saw. So there was the Mentat, who's all about recon and strategy. Their starting ability is assess weapons, which lets them scan enemies and objects in the environment, granting information about them. Then there was the Trooper class, which is all about offense and demolition. Their starting ability, Shigawire Cable, is basically a grapple hook. You shoot a barb, it attaches to a surface and then pulls you towards it. Then there was the Sword Master class, who is about close quarters aggression. Their starting ability, Deflection, has them entering a defensive stance to deflect ranged attacks. And then the final class was the Bene Gesserit Acolyte, which is about physical mastery and manipulation. Their starting ability is Voice Compel, which uses the voice to force someone towards your position from afar. So it does seem like they are going with clear different archetypes here for tailored towards different playstyles. After they finished creating a character, there was a series of cutscenes, at the end of which we see the player wake up inside of a cave. Now here you go through the typical basic survival game tutorial, being introduced to the fundamentals of movement, combat, gathering, and crafting. Here's a few notes from what we saw. The first item that you grab in the game is called the Frem Kit. This is a backpack that also acts like a mobile crafting station, letting you build your starter weapons, tools, and consumables. All the usual stuff here. Collect resources in the environment, use those to craft items. At the beginning, you can make like a makeshift melee weapon. There's a glow stick to see better in the dark, as well as the ability to heal with bandages. There's also a radial wheel in the game, so you can slot items to be able to quickly swap between them. These appear to be key-bound as well, with 8 total slots available. The game features a free climbing system where you can climb anywhere you are able to scale, we were told, all structures and terrain in the game. The developer actually specifically said that they brought over the climbing system that was created for Conan Exiles and then have combined that with a series of additional features like suspensor belts and the grappling hooks that allow for a ton more freedom of movement beyond just scaling walls. Upon emerging from the cave, we then saw another cutscene. Now they did make note here that the game has quite a big emphasis on the story. There are a lot of cutscenes and dialogues that take place as you play through the main story quest line that unfolds before you reach into the end game. After that, we saw the player out in the middle of the sand, which then introduced us to a few more of the survival mechanics. So they did say that when you're out amongst the dunes walking on open sand, any movement or action will draw the attention of sandworms. At that point, we saw one such sandworm emerging from right behind the player. It was clearly a cutscene. It was set up for this moment, but it's just, again, the introduction to the sandworm mechanic. Now, beyond avoiding the worms, you are also having to manage your heat level at all times. So any time spent standing in direct sunlight quickly builds up this temperature gauge, and once the bar is full, you receive the sunstroke debuff, which then quickly drains your water. And finding water and maintaining your water levels appears to be one of the primary survival mechanics in this game. So they say you're going to want to stay out of the sun, you're going to need to search for water, and water can be found from various sources. You're going to be able to pull water from plants to a certain level, and then after that, you will actually need to consume pure water or get water from the blood of wildlife, NPCs, and other players. There's also resource harvesting, as you expect. You'll harvest resources from things in the environment, as well as the ability to salvage materials from metal objects using this tool called the Cutter Ray. And they've actually opted for using one of the more interactive ways of harvesting. So rather than just say clicking E to harvest materials from something you're standing in front of, you actually scan any object that's harvestable. This will reveal its weak points as a line, and then you have to trace along that line to actually harvest materials from it. And they mentioned that as you progress through the game, the rarer materials will have more complex patterns for you to trace. Next, we got to take a look at the enemy outpost. These are locations that will be full of valuable loot, resources, collectibles, and of course, NPCs for you to stalk and eliminate. And this is where stuff gets interesting for me because I love clearing out enemy camps in pretty much any open world game, any survival game, whatever. This is one of the kind of gameplay systems that I really like engaging with. Before we dive into that though, here's a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Marvel Rivals, a new competitive superhero team-based PvP shooter where you can choose from a vast array of iconic Marvel characters from Guardians of the Galaxy to Avengers to X-Men and many more. Whether you're into smashing through enemies as the Incredible Hulk, unleashing high-power tech weaponry as Iron Man, or swinging into action as the Spider-Man, there's a character for every playstyle, complete with deep lore that fans of the Marvel Universe are sure to enjoy. In Marvel Rivals, teamwork is key. You'll coordinate with allies to execute unique team-up abilities between heroes to turn the tide. Whether it's Groot and Rocket linking up for a devastating combo, or Iron Man and Hulk joining forces to unleash powerful attacks, strategic collaboration is essential. And it's not just about the heroes, the environment plays a role as well. Marvel Rivals features destructible environments, allowing you to leverage the map to your advantage. Witness Black Panther strategically destroying a bridge to cut off the enemy's path, creating dynamic and unexpected scenarios. To discover more about Marvel Rivals and get access to the first closed alpha test, be sure to check out the link in the description below. All right, now let's talk about NPC bases and the game's combat. At this point, they actually swapped to another character, showing us a different class in action. They had crafted what is called a passive suspensor belt, and this basically let them glide or hover anytime they jumped into the air off of an object. What was neat about this though is that this action actually preserves momentum. So we saw the player use a grapple hook to quickly pull themselves up onto a ledge, and then they activated the suspensor belt, which had them gliding, carrying that momentum, which basically kind of slingshot them up into the air, letting them go further than they would be able to otherwise had they just used the grapple hook. Like to see this kind of more interesting and engaging traversal mechanics. In fact, at this point, the developer said that their goal was to try to make traversal fun and engaging because moving around the environment is one of the things you'll be doing most. Besides gathering, crafting, and doing the combat, you're going to be spending a lot of time moving around. So using these tools and abilities combined with the free climbing system gives players the ability to approach many encounters however they like. And they said as an example, you know, a lot of outposts will be in like these outcroppings or rock formations. So yeah, you can walk in the front door of the outpost and start taking out enemies head on, or you can climb up and kind of fall in from above, sneaking around, or, you know, however you want to approach it. But they want to have a lot of variety while also making the traversal feel engaging rather than just climbing a rock wall. You got the grapple hook, you got the levitation ability with and different other class skills that you'll be able to use that play into more engaging and dynamic traversal mechanics. Once inside the outpost, we got to see some combat and action. So the player snuck around for a little bit in a crouch position, moving around the base stealthily before pulling out this Mala pistol to take out a few patrolling guards. So the character that we saw was actually the trooper class, and they had the grapple hook ability as well as a just regular frag grenade. Now at this point, we were told that in addition to any ranged and melee weapons that you use in combat, at any given time you can select 3 active skills and 3 passive skills to have currently equipped out of a variety of options. There are classes, as we mentioned. With those classes come skill trees, and from those trees you can kind of pick and choose what you want. Although you choose a starting class, it seems like you do have the option to pull skills, active and passive abilities from the other class trees as well. I assume there's some sort of limitation, like maybe you can only fully specialize in your starting class, but you can still pick some of the earlier skills in the other tech trees. And the combat that they showed seemed fine enough. Now, nothing really stood out either for better or worse. I will say I thought the sounds and the impact animations, like how the enemy AI reacted to being hit and shot in combat, that looked decent. If anything, on the negative side, I would say the character movement appeared a little bit stiff. It didn't really seem bad by any means, but it just looked a little rigid. That's just something I took note of while we were watching this. Overall though, it seemed fun enough watching the character move through the environment, sneak around, take out enemy NPCs with ranged and melee using their skills, tossing grenades. It seemed competent. It seemed like it would be a relatively fun time. After spending a little time on the trooper class, they then swapped back to the original character, showing us the Mentat class in action and how they might approach taking on an outpost. He had access to this ability called Battlefield Calculation, which was more or less plus an area scan that marks NPCs, showing you their location as well as their class archetype, be it assault, support, whatever. After scanning the enemies, he then summoned in a hunter seeker, which is basically a drone that you manually have control of, and you have an ability that is able to one-shot any of the game's basic enemies. Now moving on, we got player bases and construction. So they introduced us to the base building system, of which they said they took the foundation of what Conan Exiles did, tried to identify some of its flaws, and then refined it into a better version for Dune Awakening. So to start out, you place down a totem on the ground, and this is basically marking the area in which you can build. At that point, you're able to do the typical base construction stuff. You'll place foundations, walls, doors, stairs, and roofs in whatever configuration you please. They are making use of a hologram system for base construction. So how this works is that you select a building piece and place it, and then a hologram appears. At that point, that hologram can be filled and completed by anyone who brings the resources to it. This is a great multiplayer method of doing base building. I have loved it in other survival games. This idea that you can place the template and then your teammates working together can help fill it instead of people having to do each piece individually. You also have access to a special tool that lets you make blueprints of any building in the game. So what they said is that you can copy an exact structure that you like. If you see a structure in the environment, you're able to copy it, and then it lets you place it elsewhere in the world and then just fill in the hologram parts yourself. This even lets you do things like pre-build structures that you can take with you on the go and drop to fill quickly. This will be especially useful in PvP zones where you don't want to spend a ton of time manually building a base piece by piece. You can go into a PvP zone with like a set PvP structure, place it, and then quickly fill it with the resources so long as you have them, again, instead of trying to build it by hand while you're also trying to keep an eye out for other players. Player crafting, lots of different crafting and refining stations, pretty much what you expect. There'll be various purifiers, fabricators, refineries, and storage. As you level up in the game, you'll earn these technology points, and then those points are spent in a tech tree that unlocks the various crafting stations. In addition to the tech tree, they also told us that there will be unique schematics that are only found while exploring and looting out in the open world, and these will include things like better versions of certain items. So if you go out and you find one of these rare schematics, this will allow you to be one of the few players to craft said item or vehicle or whatever, and then you can take those items that you make with those rare schematics and sell them on the player trading post. We got to see a handful of the game's dynamic world events. These include things like damaged spaceships and transports that will fall from the sky. These leave a trail of thick black smoke. They will carry unique and valuable resources not found anywhere else, so you will want to head out and salvage them whenever you see one of these ships crashing into the sands. However, this is also going to attract things like the sandworms and other players, which they said is used to create these tense situations where you'll see this ship crash happening and you'll want to go to it to get its valuable resources, but you're gonna have to be careful. Is the sandworm, was their attention drawn enough, and are they coming? Are other players coming to kill you, or not even just to fight you, but even other players competing to harvest the limited resources that are on the ship that just crashed? Again, all used to try to create these tense dynamic moments. Other things they have for events include at the nighttime, there are these large military ships that scan the planet looking for escaped prisoners, which you happen to be. So you'll have to pay attention to where these ships are and when they're passing by, and you need to avoid this massive sweeping searchlight, because if you get spotted, they will then send down an elite squad of NPCs to try to take you out. And I assume if you're good enough, you can actually deal with them, and there's probably some good rewards for doing that as well. And then of course, another big event that you'll be dealing with is the sandworms. They said that these exist as a constant threat throughout the game. You cannot outrun them, and you can't beat them because they're not an actual boss you can fight. The only thing you can try to do is avoid them and escape if you do draw their attention. So as we mentioned earlier, when you're moving in the open sands, anything that you do while in this space will draw the attention of the sandworm. Now, you're going to want to still go out into the open sands because there are a lot of valuable resources and loot there from those crashed ships, but also from the spice blooms. So there's a threat meter anytime you're on the sands that basically gives you an indication of how much attention you're drawing from the sandworms. Once this gets high enough, the sandworm will then appear. You're actually going to see it bursting out from the sand, making a loud commotion. So if you don't see it, if it like bursts behind you, if you don't physically see it at first, you're definitely going to hear it. You turn around, you see the sandworm like coming up from the sands, and then at that point, it chases you like a shark skimming the surface of the water, chases you with its mouth wide open, and the only thing you can do is to try to get away. You can't outrun it though. It's faster than you can potentially be, so you would either need to get into an air vehicle and fly away, or try to get into the various rock outcroppings, just basically islands of rock that are separate apart from the sand, and the sandworms can't go into the rock. So they can chase you on the sand, but if you get to the rock, you're safe, and that's basically the mechanic that you're dealing with. They did say there are items in the game, such as these thumpers, that can be used to distract the worms. However, once a worm is alerted to and starts chasing you, your only option is to run. They follow you at high speed, skimming the surface with their mouth wide open until they catch up, or until you escape to the safety of one of these rock islands. Now, next, the developer brought up the fact of the fact that they're calling this game an MMO. They said, hey, people ask us all the time, why are we calling this game an MMO? What makes it an MMO? And to which he said, the game is a series of connected servers that are all seamlessly interconnected with each other, and some of these include social server areas, such as these things known as player hubs. This appears to me to be very similar to how things like the tower work in Destiny. Here, you're going to see a large number of other people running around. This is where, besides other people, you will also find quest NPCs, trainers, merchants, the player auction house, guilds, and factions. And that was pretty much all he actually said on the matter. He didn't go into further detail about what other MMO elements it has. Now, from this, I get the impression that outside of the social hubs, all of the zones in the game will make use of phasing. So they're going to have like a set limit to the number of people you're able to see in your particular version of that zone's server. And then it's likely in the PvP zones, they will allow for a higher cap of players to allow for that large scale PvP combat that they've talked about. But otherwise, it'll be somewhat limited in the PvE zones. You know, at this point, most MMOs nowadays use something like this. We're very rarely seeing these locked shards that just have like a set player cap, and then everyone on that server sees all other players in that server. We see a lot more phasing where you might go into one zone and you're going to see people in that zone in your version of the server, but then maybe your friends could also be in that zone, but you won't see them unless you group up with them, or maybe the game does it dynamically so that anyone on your friends list always shows up in the zone. But it's phasing, it's not server shards. That's my assumption from what he described here. All right, the next interesting thing we saw were these eco labs. Now, these were described as equivalent to dungeons in other games. Of this, the developer said he likes to think of them as the vaults in Fallout. They have been sealed for 10,000 years, and when the war broke out in the game's story, people started exploring more, and as a result, they began to unlock and uncover these locations. So yeah, these are like dungeons. There'll be distinct areas where you go in, you clear enemies, and you collect loot. Sometimes there'll be bosses. Sometimes you'll go in and they'll be inhabited by tons of NPCs from various enemy factions. Other times they'll be fairly undisturbed and instead give you various new interesting experiments, puzzles, and obstacles for you to try to overcome. And they did say here that this gives them the space to play with ideas and locations different from the standard deserts above, introducing new landscapes and environments that aren't just sand absolutely everywhere. In fact, in the one eco lab that they showed us, it was like a tundra themed location. There was a ton of ice and like snow and frostbite all over the place. So yeah, these eco labs are going to let them deliver an experience that isn't just sand all over the place, which I think is really good, because that's probably one of the concerns that people had with this game. Like, how interesting is it going to be exploring the desert for 100 hours? Well, with the eco labs, they are able to deliver biomes and locations that aren't just sand and rock and sand and rock, right? So that's good. There was a stretch of combat here. We saw a few minutes of combat with two characters working together. This also showcased a few different abilities. We saw the Mentat class use this ability that revealed enemy health bars, as well as what abilities the enemies had. We saw a suspensor grenade, which caused enemies caught inside to float suspended in the air. And then we saw the Mentat class also use this like dash or blink style ability where they teleported forward towards an enemy. And then the final thing that we saw was an example of the spice hunt. So spice is at the heart of everything in this game. It's a super valuable resource. It's used for a lot of things. It's a currency, so you actually use spice to pay your taxes on the land and the base that you've built. But then also spice is used for some class skills and abilities as you progress and get more and more powerful. So spice has to be harvested out in the desert, and that's one of the things drawing you into the sands. So at this point, we saw a pair of players prepare and go out to harvest one such of these spice blow locations. So first, they actually constructed a transport ornithopter, which let them pick up and fly a spice harvester to a nearby bloom. The reason you want to do this is because the spice harvester is a ground vehicle and it moves pretty slow, and if you were to just drive the harvester over the sand, you would never make it to the bloom before you attract the attention of the sandworm and got swallowed whole. So you use the transport ornithopter, you go up and you pick up the harvester, and then you fly the harvester towards the blow. That lets you then drop the harvester down and start harvesting. So while one player was doing that, the other player was up in the ornithopter, flying in the sky and just scouting out, looking for enemy players that might be coming, paying attention to see for any signs of an upcoming sandworm. But then also, at that time, while they were harvesting this location, we saw a sandstorm appear on the horizon, moving very quickly towards the players. Now, this was obviously a pre-scripted event, but the assumption is that while playing the game, it's dynamic, and as you're playing, sandstorms will roll by. You don't want to get caught in the sandstorm, because if you're not sheltered, it kills you. So what happened was, as the sandstorm came in, we saw the ornithopter pick up the harvester, suspend it in the air, and then start flying in the opposite direction of the sandstorm, trying to make it for cover. But of course, it wouldn't be dramatic if they didn't get swallowed whole. So the sandstorm then came in, engulfed them, fade to black, and that was the end of the presentation. Again, clearly this was pre-scripted. It's not that just like a sandstorm just so happened to roll in. You know, they set this up so that it happened, but it will be dynamic in the game. That is the assumption. You will just periodically get sandstorms coming in from different directions. You'll get some sort of a warning, I assume, or there will be a huge visual indicator to let people prepare, and then they will have to try to get to cover as soon as possible. So that is the whole presentation, basically. That is a rundown. Again, this was a gameplay presentation, so we were watching gameplay of the game being played in action, where they showcase these various aspects of it. My early impressions from what we saw, you know, with the understanding that we didn't actually play, we didn't get hands-on time, but from what we saw in the presentation, some of the pros, for starters, visually, I think the game actually looks pretty darn good. It's a far cry from the original presentation, the original gameplay trailers that we saw of this game, where I thought it looked a little muddy and flat. This thing is running on Unreal Engine 5, and it is pretty obvious from the textures and the lighting in particular. I thought this game was visually pretty darn good looking. I'll also say that the particular build that we saw looked to have pretty solid performance. I didn't see any obvious frame drops or performance hitches at any point in the presentation. Now, of course, this was a pre-set up presentation. We also have no clue what hardware that the game was running on. It's likely they were using a fairly high-end rig, but still, in a lot of these presentations, no matter the hardware they're using, you can still see with the early versions of games pretty obvious performance issues, and no such thing occurred in this presentation we saw here. I also liked some of the various systems and features that they showcased. I like this like interactive harvesting where you actually have to trace along this line. I liked the various threats in the environment, the dynamic world events, dealing with the sandworm, the sandstorms, you know, ships falling from the sky. All this stuff looks and sounds really cool. Having to avoid the sun and stay in the shadows, like some really interesting systems to keep the player engaged and to keep them on their toes while they're just exploring the open world. I also thought the abilities we saw were neat. I wasn't sure what to expect. I'm not super intimately familiar with the Dune world, but I wasn't sure how interesting RPG style skills and abilities we would have access to, but we saw a levitate, we saw anti-grav things, we saw area scans, we saw drones. So it seems like if you're a fan of RPGs, open world RPGs, they have a decent variety of skills here, which is good to see. On the con side, there were a few things, as I mentioned. Some of the animations, particularly as they relate to movement and parts of the combat, looked a little stiff. Again, I wouldn't say it looked terrible, just that the animations felt a tad rigid. It may still very well feel good to play. I don't have any reason to assume it won't. I thought the gunplay looked and sounded decent, but yeah, just a little stiff here and there. That would be one early critique. Also, the way they've described the MMO elements, it's clearly not going to be a full-blown MMO, more of just a shared world, open world survival game. I think we pretty much expected that, but now it seems we have a fairly decent confirmation. My assumption, again, is going to be that in the PvP zones, when there is PvP conflict between warring factions or guilds or whatever, that is going to be the highest density of players in one location. But as you explore all the other zones in the game, it's probably going to be fairly limited due to whatever phasing tech that they use. Also, speaking of which, they didn't show any of the large-scale combat, what they are calling combined arms, where you have hundreds of players running around fighting on foot with melee, ranged weapons, and skills, along with all the vehicles, the ground and the air vehicles, and the explosions and the tanks and all that stuff. We didn't see any of this whatsoever. It was all really refined to the perspective of one or two players playing in a group. Besides them walking around the social hub, we didn't see any open world exploration or combat with more than one or two people, and we definitely didn't see that large-scale guild fighting that they are selling this game on. So maybe they're saving it for future demonstrations. Maybe it's just not there yet. Maybe in the current build it doesn't perform well. Who knows? But yeah, I would like to see that because that is one of the main selling points that they're pitching for this game. But yeah, there you go. That is the preview that we took a look at, an early exclusive event to see Dune Awakening. I like what I see overall. As always, hey man, I'm excited, looking forward to new games, hoping this is a good one, as is always the case. But that is going to do it for this video. Thank you as always. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time, all right? Take it easy.